devotion to a nation become powerful enough to overshadow humanity's desire for peace? By the middle of the 19th century, Europe stood at a crossroads. The continent was no longer simply a grand collection of monarchies and empires ruled by royal families. It had become a patchwork of distinct languages, traditions, and cultural identities, all demanding recognition. People who once saw themselves merely as subjects of a king or emperor now began to see themselves as members of a people, bound by heritage, ancestry, and shared memory. This new wave of nationalism swept through cities and villages with a force few rulers understood. Streets echoed with debates about identity. In cafes and marketplaces, intellectuals, merchants, and workers all spoke passionately about who they were and what their nations deserved. Pride took root deep, emotional, and uncompromising. A sense of moral and historical superiority hardened minds and hearts, shaping how individuals viewed themselves and others. Nationalism became more than a philosophy. It transformed into an unstoppable movement. It demanded acknowledgement, autonomy, and respect. It challenged the authority of rulers and diplomats, and it threatened the delicate balance that had kept Europe relatively stable. Every passing year seemed to tighten the tension, as if the continent was slowly turning into a giant pressure vessel, ready to burst at the slightest spark. Why did this shift matter? Because loyalty began to divide. People were torn between obedience to a ruler and allegiance to their nation, their culture, their identity. And across Europe, minority groups refused to be invisible any longer. Slavic communities inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire pushed for recognition. Hungarians demanded independence. Poles living under Russian dominion dreamed of a reborn homeland. Meanwhile, the newly unified states of Germany and Italy proved that nationalism could redraw borders and reshape power dynamics. Their success emboldened other groups to pursue self-determination. Rulers grew anxious. Governments cracked down on dissent, but repression only strengthened nationalist resolve. Every protest, demonstration, or uprising shook the foundations of centuries-old empires, unsettling rulers who sensed their authority slipping away. Europe was becoming a powder keg of competing loyalties. Could love for one's people become so fierce that it overshadowed love for peace? Nationalism revived forgotten grievances. Old wounds reopened. France continued to simmer with outrage over the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. Germany, newly risen as a continental giant, sought to solidify its power. Britain and Russia observed with suspicion, guarding their empires and global interests. Competition intensified everywhere, political, economic, and military. Nations saw industrial growth not just as progress, but as leverage. Rivalries sharpened. Minor disagreements, once solvable through diplomacy, now carried the weight of national pride. A small insult could escalate into a crisis. A single border dispute could threaten the entire continent. Europe became dangerously volatile, a continent fueled by ambition, wounded history, and national pride. But an even greater transformation was underway. The Industrial Revolution had given nations tools that made their rivalries infinitely more dangerous. Machines changed everything. A new question arose. Could human pride become deadlier when paired with mechanical power? Railroads now connected entire countries, allowing massive armies to move with unprecedented speed. Factories produced rifles, artillery, and ammunition in staggering quantities. Coal and steel-driven naval shipyards built enormous battleships that projected power far beyond any one nation's borders. Nationalism and industrialization, once separate forces, merged into a powerful and unpredictable alliance. Pride could be turned into military capability almost instantly. Conflicts could escalate at speeds never seen before. A local dispute could grow into a continental crisis in days, not months. Europe was no longer just an ideological battleground. It had become armed, mechanized, and ready to mobilize at a moment's notice. Political tension merged with technological advancement, creating a situation where one spark could ignite a disaster the world had never experienced. And that spark lay in one of Europe's most unstable regions, the Balkans. It was a small cluster of nations, yet the most volatile pressure point on the continent. Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece all sought territory, influence, and independence. The Austro-Hungarian Empire struggled to contain its restive Slavic populations. Russia positioned itself as the defender of Slavic peoples, adding another layer of tension. In the Balkans, nationalism, history, and imperial ambition collided daily. Even a minor uprising or assassination threatened to trigger an international crisis. It was a region where every action had consequences far beyond its borders. Europe looked on with anxiety, aware that the Balkans represented a small-scale version of the continent's larger problems. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, a moment that would change world history, was not a random tragedy. It was the spark the continent had been steadily preparing for through decades of rivalry, nationalism, and militarization. Could treaties intended to preserve peace end up dragging nations into catastrophe? Europe's alliance system, designed to maintain balance, instead created a trap. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, France, Russia, and Britain were bound by mutual defense agreements. Any conflict involving one power risked pulling all the others into war. National pride became intertwined with international obligations. Once one piece of the puzzle moved, the rest followed. A small incident in Sarajevo could now trigger a domino effect across the continent. And that is exactly what happened. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, visited Sarajevo, a city filled with tension and resistance. Among the crowds was a young nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, when two gunshots shattered the air. Europe's fragile peace was exposed. The Archduke and his wife were dead. The continent did not explode instantly, but behind closed doors, leaders and diplomats understood the danger. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany vowed to support Austria-Hungary. Russia prepared to defend Serbia. Each nation acted out of pride and obligation, locking itself into a course of action from which retreat seemed impossible. Once mobilization began, could Europe stop itself? Industrialized war machinery, railways, telegraphs, and factories took over. Armies moved with precision. Generals relied on pre-written plans. Citizens cheered parades, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the deadliest wars in human history. The assassination was not the cause of the war. It was merely the spark. The true cause lay in decades of rising nationalism, growing military power, and tangled alliances. Europe had built a machine that, once switched on, could not be stopped. Ordinary people sensed something looming. Food was stocked. Soldiers trained harder. Newspapers filled minds with fear and pride. Many believed the war would be short, glorious, maybe even cleansing. They could not have been more wrong. Europe stood on the edge of a catastrophe created by ambition, pride, machinery, and identity, each element strengthening the next until conflict became inevitable. What lesson should the modern world take from this? The story of Europe in 1914 offers a warning that remains timeless. Pride without restraint, identity without tolerance, and ambition without foresight can transform progress into calamity. Nationalism itself was not inherently destructive. It united people, celebrated culture, and gave voice to those long ignored. But when nationalism fused with technology, militarism, and political miscalculations, it became a weapon. The world of today must remember how quickly pride can escalate. It must remember how identity can divide. It must remember how technology can magnify conflict, if not tempered by wisdom. Europe's path to war was not a sudden collapse. It was a chain reaction built over decades. Understanding that chain may be the key to preventing future disasters. As Europe drifted toward the 20th century, nationalism continued to evolve. It became more emotionally charged, more politically influential, and far more dangerous. Nations began viewing themselves not merely as communities sharing language and culture, but as entities destined for greatness. Each believed it carried a unique mission or historical purpose. This belief deepened rivalries and made cooperation increasingly fragile. National identity became a source of pride, but also a justification for confrontation. People across Europe grew more aware of their heritage, and with awareness came demands. There were demands for recognition, for self-rule, and for expansion. Governments, often conservative and traditional, struggled to manage this surge of popular emotion. Their attempts to silence nationalist movements only fueled them further. From university students to factory workers, everyone seemed to be discussing sovereignty, cultural rights, and the future of their people. The continent felt like a vast debating hall, where every conversation held the potential to shape history. With nationalism strengthening, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Old empires appeared increasingly outdated in a world where people desired self-determination. Monarchs, who once commanded unquestioned loyalty, now faced citizens who asked hard questions. Why should national identity be subordinate to imperial rule? Why must cultural uniqueness dissolve under the weight of empires? This growing discontent was especially visible in multi-ethnic empires like Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. These sprawling political entities governed dozens of ethnic groups, each with its own history and aspirations. Holding them together required delicate political balancing, but nationalism shattered that balance. The more rulers tried to enforce unity, the more divisive their empires became. Meanwhile, the successes of Germany and Italy, proof of what nationalist unity could achieve, sent a clear message. Self-determined nations could rise to immense power. Germany's rapid ascent, in particular, shook the continent. Its newfound industrial might, military innovation, and unified political leadership transformed it into a formidable power in just a few decades. This rise did not go unnoticed. Older powers like France and Britain watched Germany's strength grow with increasing anxiety. Russia, too, grew uneasy, sensing that Europe's future would not resemble its past. Rivalries sharpened as nations pursued their own agendas. Military budgets expanded. Colonial ambitions intensified. Newspapers stirred public sentiment, often portraying rivals as threats to national dignity. Politicians fueled patriotic fervor, believing that national pride could unite their people and secure their power. The atmosphere across Europe grew increasingly tense, as if the entire continent were being pulled in different directions by competing aspirations. Alongside nationalism, Europe's industrial transformation continued at full speed. Factories spread across cities. Economic competition intertwined with military ambition. What once took months to produce could now be manufactured in weeks. This new efficiency enabled nations to build larger armies, stronger navies, and more advanced weaponry. Technology multiplied national power and, in doing so, multiplied the consequences of national conflict. Railways in particular revolutionized warfare. Previously, mobilizing an army was a slow, laborious process. Now, tens of thousands of soldiers could be transported across a nation within days. Artillery, ammunition, and supplies could all be moved with unprecedented speed. Military plans began relying heavily on rail networks, making mobilization a rigid, almost mechanical process. Once set in motion, it became extremely difficult to stop. This rigidity of military planning would prove catastrophic in 1914. Europe's diplomatic structure, built to maintain balance through alliances, ironically trapped nations in a system where flexibility vanished. The great powers believed alliances would deter war by presenting a united front, but they failed to recognize the dangers of binding obligations. When every nation was tied to another by treaties of support, any conflict for any reason could escalate rapidly. These alliances divided Europe into two increasingly hostile blocs. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. Both sides believed their alliances would ensure security. Instead, they created a fragile equilibrium where one disturbance could collapse the entire structure. Nowhere was this imbalance more visible than in the Balkans. This small region acted as a microcosm of Europe's larger tensions. For decades, the Balkans had been a battleground of empires, religions, and ethnic identities. The decline of the Ottoman Empire opened a vacuum that Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Austria-Hungary, and Russia all sought to fill. Nationalist movements surged. Small nations sought to expand their borders. Larger empires tried to prevent their collapse. It was in this volatile region that Europe's tensions converged. Serbia, emboldened by recent victories and driven by Slavic nationalism, sought to unite all southern Slavs under its leadership. Austria-Hungary viewed this ambition as an existential threat. Russia saw Serbia as a brotherly nation that needed safeguarding. Germany, wanting to protect its ally Austria-Hungary, became increasingly involved in Balkan affairs. The Balkans became a stage where small actions produced enormous reactions. And into this cauldron stepped Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His visit to Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, was meant to be a demonstration of imperial presence. But Sarajevo was filled with nationalist anger. The Archduke represented a government many Slavs believed suppressed their identity. His appearance was seen as a provocation. Among the spectators that day was Gavrilo Princip, a young nationalist whose determination mirrored the emotional fire burning across Europe. When he raised his pistol and fired 2 shots, he did far more than take 2 lives. He cracked open the fragile shell that had held Europe together. Initially, the continent remained eerily calm. There were no immediate declarations of war and no instant mobilizations. Diplomats exchanged messages. Leaders met behind closed doors. But beneath the surface, the machinery of nationalism, alliances, and militarism had begun to turn. The assassination became a symbol, an opportunity for some, a threat for others. Austria-Hungary viewed it as the ideal moment to crush Serbia. Germany saw a chance to assert its power. Russia refused to abandon Serbia. France stood by Russia. Britain grew alarmed as events spiraled. The system of alliances did not prevent war. It ensured it. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia accepted most demands, but rejected parts that undermined its sovereignty. This was enough for Austria-Hungary to declare war. Russia mobilized to shield Serbia. Germany responded by declaring war on Russia. France, allied with Russia, mobilized in turn. Germany, following its military plan, invaded Belgium to reach France quickly. Britain, bound to Belgium's neutrality, entered the war. In a breathtaking sequence of decisions, Europe transformed from a continent at peace to a continent at war in less than a month. Ordinary citizens watched these events unfold with a mixture of excitement, fear, and confusion. Crowds cheered soldiers marching through the streets. Propaganda portrayed war as a test of national strength. Many believed it would be a grand adventure, over within weeks. Newspapers described mobilization as a patriotic duty. Even intellectuals, who usually preached caution, were swept up in the wave of nationalism. But beneath the enthusiasm lay an unspoken dread. Some sensed that something irreversible had begun. Families stocked food, unsure how long supplies would last. Farmers worried about their fields as young men left for the army. Merchants feared economic collapse. Mothers held their sons tighter than usual, wondering if they would ever return. Europe had stepped into a conflict created not by a single event, but by decades of unchecked pride, political miscalculations, imperial ambition, and technological power. Nations had tied their fates so tightly together that once one moved, none could escape the pull. And yet, the world today can still learn from the tragedy that unfolded. National identity can inspire unity, strength, and resilience. But when identity becomes exclusionary, hostile, or arrogant, it blinds nations to compromise. Pride can unite people, but it can also divide them. Technology can advance civilization, but in the wrong hands, it magnifies destruction. Alliances can preserve peace, but if built without flexibility, they become traps. Europe's journey toward war was not an accident. It was the result of choices repeated, reinforced, and rarely questioned. As Europe marched toward the Great War, it proved that ideas once unleashed can become more powerful than the people who created them. As the Great War dragged on, the world began to recognize that Europe had created a conflict far beyond anything imagined. The war that many believed would be settled in a matter of weeks now stretched into years. Generals clung to outdated strategies. Politicians struggled to maintain morale. Civilians bore the weight of shortages, grief, and uncertainty. Across all fronts, soldiers fought in conditions so brutal that they reshaped the very meaning of war. The battlefield had transformed into a vast industrial arena. Trenches stretched for hundreds of miles, winding like scars across Europe's body. These trenches became homes, prisons, and graves. Soldiers lived in mud that swallowed boots. Rats grew fat from feeding on the dead. Waterlogged walls collapsed after rainstorms. The constant roar of artillery shattered sleep and fractured nerves. Poison gas drifted silently through the air, its clouds bringing agony and terror. In earlier ages, wars were defined by movement armies, advancing, retreating, and maneuvering. But this was a war of stagnation. Millions of men faced each other across narrow strips of land, separated by barbed wire and death. Every attempt to break the stalemate came at enormous human cost. Entire divisions were lost for the sake of a few hundred yards. The Industrial Revolution, which had promised progress, efficiency, and prosperity, now supplied unending destruction. Machine guns mowed down charging soldiers in seconds. Mortars rained explosives onto trenches without pause. Railways delivered reinforcements and munitions faster than ever before, ensuring battles could continue long after older armies would have collapsed. The cruelty of modern weaponry shocked even hardened commanders. And yet, nations pushed forward not because victory seemed near, but because pride, alliances, and sacrifice left them no choice. To retreat meant admitting defeat. To negotiate meant acknowledging that the war's goals had been illusions from the start. Leaders feared the political consequences. Generals feared being blamed for failure. Civilians feared betraying soldiers who had already died. Nationalism kept the war alive as much as military power did. Leaders framed the conflict as a test of national character, a struggle to prove worthiness on the world stage. Many people clung to this belief because the alternative was unbearable. The possibility that millions were suffering for nothing, the social fabric of Europe strained under the pressure. Food became scarce. Prices soared. Factories struggled to meet demands. Women took on roles once limited to men, managing farms, factories, businesses, and households. Their contributions sustained nations and began reshaping gender roles forever. Children grew up in a world defined by war, learning to read headlines before storybooks. As the war intensified, empires that once seemed eternal began to fatigue. Austria-Hungary struggled to maintain unity among its many ethnic groups. The Ottoman Empire faced internal revolts and external pressures. Russia's government, already fragile, buckled under the enormous strain of casualties and economic collapse. Revolutions simmered beneath the surface, fueled by anger, hunger, and despair. Even in Western Europe, where governments remained more stable, the war's emotional toll was immense. Politicians faced public demands for answers. Families questioned why so many lives were lost for so little progress. Newspapers, once enthusiastic, began to acknowledge the harsh reality. But despite all suffering, the war continued because stopping seemed harder than fighting. Alliances demanded commitment. Generals insisted victory was close. Leaders feared that negotiating peace too soon would dishonor the fallen. To understand why the war persisted, one must recognize the forces that created it. The forces deeply rooted in identity, ambition, and fear. Nationalism had convinced nations they were destined for greatness. Industrialization had given them weapons capable of unprecedented destruction. Alliances had locked nations into mutual obligations from which escape seemed impossible. And human pride, perhaps the most powerful force of all, kept nations marching forward. As the conflict entered its later years, signs of collapse began to appear. The economies of Europe strained under the burden of war. Food shortages sparked riots. Political divisions deepened. Soldiers became demoralized. Desertions increased. Letters from the front lines revealed growing disillusionment. Many soldiers no longer believed in the glorious ideals of 1914. They had seen too much death, too much suffering, and too much futility. Meanwhile, outside Europe, the war's impact spread across continents. Colonies sent millions of troops and laborers. Nations far from the front lines supplied resources, ships, and weapons. The war reshaped global relationships, empowering some regions while weakening others. America, initially neutral, watched the conflict with increasing concern. German submarine warfare and diplomatic missteps eventually pushed the United States into the war. This entry altered the balance of power dramatically. Fresh American troops, resources, and industrial capability gave the Allies a decisive advantage. On the other side, the Central Powers struggled. Germany faced a naval blockade that starved its population and industries. Austria-Hungary weakened under internal divisions. The Ottoman Empire battled both internal revolts and external enemies. Bulgaria, exhausted, sought an end to the conflict. When Russia withdrew due to revolution, Germany briefly saw hope, but it was too late. The entry of the United States tipped the scales. By 1918, the Central Powers were breaking. Germany launched a final massive offensive, hoping to end the war before American forces fully arrived. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. German troops advanced rapidly, but the momentum faltered. Exhaustion, lack of supplies, and strong Allied counterattacks halted the offensive. When Allied forces pushed back, Germany could not recover. Revolutions erupted across collapsing empires. Monarchies fell, governments resigned, armies mutinied, people everywhere demanded an end to the suffering. The war machine, which had seemed unstoppable, was finally grinding to a halt under the weight of its own destruction. When the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, Europe was unrecognizable. Borders were redrawn. Monarchies disappeared. Ancient empires lay in ruins. Nations emerged from the ashes, some hopeful, some bitter, some broken. The psychological scars were immense. Nearly every family across the continent had lost someone. Entire towns mourned missing generations. And yet, even as peace returned, the world struggled to understand how it had allowed such a catastrophe to occur. How had a single assassination spiraled into a global war? How had pride, alliances, nationalism, and industrial capability overshadowed reason? The lesson was painfully clear. The systems designed to maintain balance had instead magnified danger. The alliances formed to deter war had guaranteed it. The nationalism meant to inspire unity had fueled division. The industrial power meant to improve life had enabled destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. This was Europe's tragedy, born not from a single decision, but from decades of choices shaped by identity, pride, ambition, and fear. The Great War demonstrated that progress without wisdom becomes perilous, and nationalism without restraint becomes explosive. In the aftermath, societies began questioning everything: governments, traditions, leaders, and even their own assumptions about identity. Nations sought to rebuild, but rebuilding required understanding. The war forced Europe to confront the consequences of loyalty without caution, pride without humility, and ambition without foresight. The world today must remember these lessons. National identity is powerful, but when weaponized, it blinds people to empathy and compromise. Technology is transformative, but without responsibility, it magnifies danger. Alliances provide security, but without flexibility, they create rigid systems where mistakes spiral out of control. The path to war had been built slowly, over decades. The spark was small, but the powder was everywhere. Modern society must recognize that peace is never guaranteed. It must be protected through understanding, restraint, and awareness. History shows that catastrophe does not emerge from a single moment, but from many moments ignored. Wars are not accidents, they are consequences. And the greatest threat to peace is not the enemy beyond borders, but the unchecked forces within them.